May 11th, 2023, 6 a.m., Fort McMurray, Alberta. The sun rises through a thin haze that most residents dismiss as typical spring weather. Coffee shops open along Franklin Avenue. Kids get ready for the last weeks of school. Oil workers head out for another shift in the tar sands, the economic engine that has powered this northern city for decades. The air quality app on their phones shows moderate readings, nothing unusual for a region where industrial activity and natural weather patterns often create atmospheric conditions that locals have learned to live with. What none of them know is that 200 miles to the south, something is beginning that will turn their spring into a global catastrophe. By summer's end, smoke from Canadian wildfires will circle the globe, killing more than 80,000 people worldwide and creating the worst air quality crisis in human history. The fires that start today will burn an area larger than most countries and send a message of smoke and death to every continent on Earth. The 2023 Canadian wildfire season began not with a single spark, but with a perfect storm of conditions that had been building for months. Canada had just experienced its warmest winter on record, with temperatures running 5.8 degrees Celsius above the historical average. The snow that normally provides crucial moisture to forests and grasslands had melted weeks earlier than usual, leaving vast expanses of tinder-dry vegetation across the country. But it was the weather pattern that developed in early May that transformed these dry conditions into a continental disaster. A massive high-pressure system settled over western Canada, creating what meteorologists call a heat dome, a cap of hot, dry air that acts like a lid on a pot, trapping heat close to the ground and preventing the formation of rain clouds. Under this dome, temperatures soared to unprecedented levels. In Alberta, the mercury hit 30 degrees Celsius in early May, nearly 15 degrees above normal for the time of year. Relative humidity dropped to single digits across vast areas of the boreal forest. The moisture content of trees, grasses, and forest floor debris fell to levels that fire scientists describe as explosive, so dry that a single spark could ignite fires that would burn for months. The first major fire of the season erupted on May 11th near Slave Lake, Alberta. Within hours, it had consumed 1,000 hectares. By the end of the day, it had burned 5,000 hectares. Local fire crews accustomed to battling blazes in this fire-prone region attacked the flames with everything they had. But this fire was different. It was burning with an intensity and speed that veteran firefighters had never seen before. What made the 2023 fires so dangerous wasn't just their size or intensity, it was their behavior. These weren't the slow-moving ground fires that typically characterize early season burning. These were crown fires, leaping from treetop to treetop at speeds of up to 10 kilometers per hour, creating their own weather systems and generating fire tornadoes that could hurl burning debris kilometers ahead of the main fire front. By May 15th, fires were burning across Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. The Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center raised the national preparedness level to 5, the highest possible rating, indicating that wildfire activity was significant across multiple jurisdictions and that international assistance would be needed. But even as fire managers called for help, they were beginning to realize that this season would exceed anything in their experience. The fires weren't just burning, they were exploding across the landscape, consuming forests that had stood for centuries in a matter of hours. In some areas, fires were advancing 50 kilometers in a single day, outrunning evacuation efforts and trapping communities that had never before been threatened by wildfire. The human drama began unfolding in communities across northern Canada. In Yellowknife, capital of the Northwest Territories and home to 20,000 people, residents watched nervously as fires crept closer to the city limits. The community had always lived with the threat of wildfire. It's part of life in the boreal forest. But these fires were behaving in ways that defied all previous experience. Sarah McKenzie, a nurse at Stanton Territorial Hospital, had lived in Yellowknife for 15 years. She had seen fire seasons come and go, had watched smoke plumes on the horizon, and smelled the familiar scent of burning forest that marked summer in the north. But on the morning of May 20th, when she stepped outside her home, something was different. The air was thick with smoke, but not the distant haze she was used to. This smoke was heavy, acrid, and so dense she could barely see across the street. The The sun, when it was visible at all, appeared as a dim orange disk through the murk. Her throat burned with each breath, and her eyes began to water immediately. Inside the hospital, the emergency department was filling with patients complaining of breathing difficulties. Elderly residents with chronic lung conditions were arriving in respiratory distress. Children were being brought in by parents worried about persistent coughing and wheezing. The hospital's air filtration system, designed for normal conditions, was overwhelmed by the unprecedented levels of particulate matter in the air. What Sarah and her colleagues didn't know was that they were witnessing the beginning of a global health crisis. The smoke from the Canadian fires wasn't just affecting local communities. It was being carried by high-altitude winds across continents, creating air quality emergencies in cities thousands of kilometers away. By June 1st, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. More than 400 fires were burning across Canada, with 200 of them classified as out of control. The total area burned had already exceeded 3 million hectares, larger than the entire country of Belgium. And the fire season was just beginning. The fires were creating their own weather patterns, generating massive pyrocumulus clouds that rose 15 kilometers into the atmosphere. These towering columns of smoke and ash were being caught by the jet stream and carried eastward across North America and beyond. Satellite images showed ribbons of smoke stretching from Canada to Europe, creating a pollution highway that spanned the globe. In New York City, 3,000 kilometers from the nearest major fire, residents woke up on June 7th to an apocalyptic scene. The sky had turned an eerie orange color, and the air was thick with smoke. The city's air quality index, which normally ranges from 0 to 100, spiked to over 400, levels considered hazardous to human health. The Statue of Liberty, normally visible from Manhattan, disappeared into the haze. The Empire State Building was barely visible from street level. Schools canceled outdoor activities, and health officials urged residents to stay indoors. For many New Yorkers, it was their first direct experience with the reality of climate change. A disaster happening thousands of kilometers away was making their city unlivable. But New York was just the beginning. As the summer progressed, smoke from the Canadian fires reached cities across the United States, from Chicago to Washington, D.C. to Atlanta. Air quality alerts were issued for more than 100 million Americans. Hospitals reported increases in emergency room visits for respiratory problems. Outdoor events were canceled, and millions of people found themselves prisoners in their own homes, afraid to breathe the toxic air outside. The global reach of the disaster became apparent as smoke crossed the Atlantic Ocean. In Norway, air quality monitors detected particulate matter from the Canadian fires. In France, the normally clear skies over Paris were hazed with smoke that had traveled 6,000 kilometers from its source. Even in the United Kingdom, sensitive instruments picked up traces of the Canadian catastrophe. Back in Canada, entire communities were being evacuated as fires approached populated areas. The town of Hay River in the Northwest Territories, home to 3,500 people, was evacuated on May 15th as fires threatened the community from multiple directions. Residents had just hours to pack their belongings and flee, many not knowing if they would ever see their homes again. The evacuation of Yellowknife on August 16th became one of the largest emergency evacuations in Canadian history. All 20,000 residents were ordered to leave the city within 48 hours as fires approached the capital. The single highway leading south became a river of vehicles as families fled with whatever they could carry. For many evacuees, the experience was traumatic beyond the immediate danger. These were communities where families had lived for generations, where indigenous peoples had maintained traditional connections to the land for thousands of years. The fires weren't just threatening buildings, they were threatening entire ways of life. The economic impact was staggering. The oil sands operations around Fort McMurray, which produce much of Canada's petroleum, were forced to shut down as smoke made it impossible for workers to operate safely outdoors. Forestry operations across the country ground to a halt. Tourism, a vital industry in many northern communities, collapsed as visitors canceled trips to avoid the toxic air. But it was the health impact that truly revealed the global scale of the disaster. A study published in the journal Nature found that smoke from the 2023 Canadian fires was responsible for approximately 82,100 premature deaths worldwide. The tiny particles in wildfire smoke, known as PM 2.5, are small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs and enter the bloodstream, causing heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory failure. The victims weren't just in Canada or even North America. In Europe, where the smoke arrived as a thin but persistent haze, an estimated 22,000 people died prematurely from exposure to the Canadian fire pollution. These were mostly elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions, but they included children and healthy adults whose bodies couldn't cope with the unprecedented levels of toxic particles in the air. 9-year-old Carter Vi was among the youngest victims. Living in British Columbia with his mother Amber, Carter had asthma but was generally healthy and active. On July 15th, he attended summer camp despite his mother's concerns about the air quality. The local monitoring station, 60 miles away, showed acceptable levels, but the readings didn't capture the invisible pollutants that were choking the air around their home. That evening, Carter began coughing uncontrollably. His mother followed all the protocols: emergency inhaler, steroid medication, cooling bath, but nothing worked. As they rushed to the hospital, Carter told his father, "This isn't good." He died that night from an asthma attack triggered by wildfire smoke, becoming one of the youngest documented victims of the 2023 fire season. Carter's death sparked his mother Amber to action. Working with the BC Lung Foundation, she began distributing air quality monitors to communities that lacked adequate coverage. His life was taken way too soon, but he's out there saving lives for other kids and adults, she said. The initiative, known as Carter's Project, has brought monitoring equipment to dozens of remote communities across Canada. The international response to the crisis was unprecedented. 12 countries in the European Union sent firefighters, equipment, and aircraft to help battle the blazes. More than 5,500 international personnel joined the fight, creating one of the largest international disaster response efforts in history. French firefighters worked alongside Canadian crews in Quebec. Portuguese water bombers dropped retardant on fires in British Columbia. South African specialists shared their expertise in managing large-scale wildfire incidents. For the first time, the global nature of the wildfire threat was being met with a truly global response. But even with international help, the fires continued to burn. By the end of July, more than 10 million hectares had burned, an area larger than South Korea. The smoke was so thick in some regions that it was visible from space, creating massive plumes that stretched across entire provinces. The fires were also releasing unprecedented amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Scientists estimated that the 2023 Canadian fires emitted nearly 480 megatons of carbon, almost 5 times the Canadian average for the past 20 years and accounting for 23% of global wildfire emissions that year. This was equivalent to the annual emissions of a medium-sized country, adding to the greenhouse gases that were driving the climate change that made such extreme fire seasons more likely. The environmental impact extended far beyond carbon emissions. Entire ecosystems that had evolved over thousands of years were being destroyed in a matter of days. Wildlife populations were decimated as animals fled the flames or were trapped by the speed of the fire's advance. Rivers and lakes were contaminated with ash and debris, affecting water quality for communities downstream. The cultural impact was equally devastating. For Indigenous communities across Canada, the fires were destroying sacred sites, traditional hunting and gathering areas, and landscapes that held thousands of years of cultural significance. The knowledge systems that had been passed down through generations, understanding of seasonal patterns, wildlife behavior, and land management practices were being disrupted by changes happening faster than communities could adapt. As autumn arrived and cooler temperatures finally began to slow the fires, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. The 2023 Canadian wildfire season had burned more than 15 million hectares, an area larger than Greece and more than double the previous record set in 1989. It had displaced more than 200,000 people, destroyed thousands of structures, and created air quality emergencies on multiple continents. The economic cost was estimated at more than $9 billion in direct damages, but the true cost, including health impacts, lost productivity, and environmental damage, was incalculable. Insurance companies faced billions in claims, while governments at all levels struggled to fund recovery efforts and prepare for future fire seasons that scientists warned would likely be even worse. The 2023 fires also revealed critical gaps in Canada's wildfire management system. Despite decades of experience fighting fires, the country's resources were overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the blazes. Equipment designed for typical fire seasons proved inadequate for the extreme conditions. Communication systems failed under the strain of coordinating responses across multiple provinces and territories. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that the 2023 season might not be an anomaly, but a preview of the new normal. Climate scientists had been warning for years that rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns would make extreme fire seasons more common. The 2023 fires provided a devastating confirmation of those predictions. Today, as communities across Canada continue to recover from the 2023 fire season, the lessons learned are being incorporated into new approaches to wildfire management. Building codes are being updated to make structures more fire-resistant. Evacuation procedures are being revised to account for the speed at which modern fires can spread. Air quality monitoring networks are being expanded to provide better early warning of smoke events. But the most important lesson of 2023 may be the recognition that wildfires are no longer just a local or even national problem. In an interconnected world where smoke can travel across oceans and affect the health of people on distant continents, wildfire management must become a global priority. The official death toll from the 2023 Canadian wildfire season stands at over 82,000 people worldwide, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. But unlike earthquakes or hurricanes, which kill quickly and in concentrated areas, the wildfire deaths were spread across continents and occurred over months, making the true scale of the tragedy difficult to comprehend. For the families of victims like Carter Vi, the statistics provide little comfort, but their stories serve as a reminder that behind every number is a human life cut short by a disaster that began in the forests of Canada and reached around the world. The 2023 wildfire season didn't just burn trees, it revealed the deadly interconnectedness of our global atmosphere and the urgent need for international cooperation in addressing the climate crisis that makes such disasters increasingly likely. If you're concerned about wildfire smoke in your area, consider supporting organizations that monitor air quality and provide resources for vulnerable communities. And if you want to learn more about how climate change is affecting wildfire patterns and what can be done to address this growing threat, there are research institutions and advocacy groups working on solutions that deserve our attention and support. The smoke from the 2023 Canadian fires has long since cleared from the skies over New York and Paris and London. But the lessons of that terrible summer remain in the air we breathe, a reminder that in our interconnected world, a fire that starts in one forest can end a life on the other side of the globe.